When 73-year-old Margaret Holloway receives the keys to a charred, condemned house as her only inheritance from a town that forgot her name, she expects nothing but ash and abandonment. But within the blackened walls of what was once her childhood home, she discovers something impossible, a hidden room untouched by flame, containing objects that shouldn't exist and memories that were never hers. As Margaret peels back layers of smoke-stained wallpaper and soot-covered secrets, she uncovers a truth about her own past that will shatter everything she believed about love, loss, and the nature of home itself. This is not a story about rebuilding a house. This is a story about excavating a soul. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, which Margaret would later recognize as significant, though she couldn't say why. It was thin, bureaucratic, the kind of correspondence that carried neither hope nor danger, merely obligation. She held it near the kitchen window where afternoon light fell in strips across the linoleum, and for reasons she couldn't articulate, her hands trembled slightly as she worked her thumb beneath the seal. The return address read Estate Services Division, County Clerk's Office. Words that meant endings, the administrative acknowledgement of something finished. Inside, a single page informed her that she had inherited property at 17 Ashwood Lane. The address struck her like a name called across a crowded room, familiar yet impossibly distant. She had not thought of Ashwood Lane in 54 years, had trained herself not to think of it, the way you learn not to touch a scar that never quite healed. The letter was sparse with detail but generous with conditions. The structure had sustained severe fire damage, was condemned by the city, and she had 90 days to claim or forfeit ownership. Attached by a rusted paper clip was a single key, small and brass, its teeth worn smooth by decades of use. Margaret held it up to the light and watched dust particles spiral in the beam, tiny galaxies collapsing and reforming, and she wondered what doors locked so long ago finally demanded opening. She made the drive 3 days later in her daughter's borrowed sedan, winding through neighborhoods that had transformed while she wasn't watching. The town had grown around its old bones like flesh around shrapnel, new developments sprouting where cornfields once stood, strip malls colonizing the spaces where she remembered open sky. But as she turned onto Ashwood Lane, the years fell away with unsettling precision. The street remained narrow, canopied by ancient oaks whose branches formed a tunnel of green shadow. She counted houses as she crawled forward, 11, 13, 15, and then there it was, set back from the road behind a tangle of wild rose and blackberry vine, its windows dark as shut eyes. The house looked smaller than memory allowed, shrunken by time or perhaps by her own expansion into adulthood. But the damage was exactly as catastrophic as the letter had promised. The right side of the structure had collapsed inward, roof timbers exposed like broken ribs, and black streaks of soot climbed the exterior walls in patterns that resembled reaching fingers. Yellow caution tape fluttered around the property line, faded by sun and weather into something closer to pale cream, a warning that had lost its urgency. Margaret sat in the idling car for 7 minutes by the dashboard clock, engine humming, hands at 10 and 2, while something inside her chest fought between the impulse to flee and the compulsion to enter. The key in her pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, as if accumulating weight from all the years it had waited. When she finally stepped from the car, the air smelled of carbon and wild growth, of things burned and things blooming. She moved through waist-high grass that whispered against her legs, past a rusted mailbox hanging by a single nail, toward the front door that hung ajar like a half-open mouth. Behind her, a crow called from an oak branch, its voice sharp and questioning. Margaret paused at the threshold, one hand braced against the door frame where paint had bubbled and peeled away in scales. She could hear her own breathing, loud and deliberate, and beneath it, something else. The house settling or memories shifting, or perhaps just the sound of a life about to split open along fault lines she didn't know existed. She stepped inside, and the floorboards groaned their recognition. The interior was a cathedral of ruin. Afternoon light penetrated through gaps in the collapsed roof, creating shafts of illumination that turned floating dust into something almost sacred, like incense smoke in abandoned churches. Margaret stood in what had once been a living room, her feet crunching over debris, charred wood, broken glass, the desiccated remains of curtains that had burned and fossilized mid-flutter. The walls still bore the phantom outlines of picture frames, their shapes preserved in soot like photographic negatives. She could see where the sofa had stood, where the television had sat, where her mother's reading chair had occupied the corner near the window. These absences were more present than any object could be, carved into the space itself. She moved slowly, methodically, as if navigating a crime scene or archaeological site, both of which she supposed it was. The fire had occurred 6 months ago, according to the letter, started by a faulty wire in a house that had stood empty for 3 decades. The previous owner, a name Margaret didn't recognize, had died intestate, and the property had reverted through some labyrinthine legal process back to the original deed holder, which inexplicably turned out to be Margaret's name. She had never owned this house, had fled it at 19 and never looked back. Yet here was bureaucracy insisting on her connection, dragging her home through chains of paperwork and municipal code. In the kitchen, the linoleum had melted in places, creating pools of frozen ripples like a sea caught mid-wave. The sink remained intact, an island of porcelain in a landscape of char. Margaret turned the faucet experimentally and was shocked when rust-brown water coughed from the tap, sputtering and gasping before settling into a thin stream. She let it run, watching the color lighten from rust amber to something approaching clear, and found herself thinking about veins, about old blood finding its way through dormant systems, about things that persist despite all reason suggesting they should stop. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, testing each step before committing her weight, listening for the creak that would warn a collapse. The banister was sticky with residue, and her palm came away black. Halfway up, she paused at a photograph that somehow remained on the wall, not burned, merely smoke-stained to sepia. It showed a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, standing in a garden Margaret didn't remember, holding a doll Margaret had forgotten. The girl's face was obscured by smoke damage, features blurred into abstraction, but Margaret knew it was her from the white ribbon in the hair, the specific angle of the shoulders, the way the right foot turned slightly inward. The upstairs hallway was darker, less damaged, as if the fire had lost interest halfway through its consumption. 3 doors stood closed along its length, and Margaret approached the first, her childhood bedroom, with a sensation like vertigo, as if the ground beneath her might suddenly drop away. She reached for the knob, and her hand passed through a shaft of dusty light. And in that moment she was simultaneously 73 and 9 years old, simultaneously standing in the present, and trapped in every moment she had ever stood in this hallway before. The room beyond was almost pristine, while fire had ravaged the rest of the house. This space seemed to have been spared by some quirk of air current or structural luck. The walls were yellowed with age, but intact, still bearing the rosebud wallpaper she had picked out from a catalog when she was 12. The bed remained, stripped of bare mattress, its frame and iron skeleton covered in rust bloom. But it was the window that arrested her attention, unbroken clear, looking out onto a backyard that had become a wilderness of sumac and wild grape. Margaret crossed the window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Below, she could see the outline of what had been a garden, now overgrown but still geometrically evident in the way certain plants clustered and others avoided specific areas, as if soil remembered what had been asked of it decades ago. And beyond the garden, at the property's edge, stood the old tool shed, its door hanging open like a dark mouth, its interior invisible from this angle but present in her memory with the clarity of a wound that never properly closed. She turned from a window and surveyed the room with an appraiser's eye, trying to understand why this particular space had survived. There was no logical reason. The fire consumed rooms above and below, had taken a hallway outside this door, yet had somehow skipped this chamber entirely. It defied physics, defied sense, and Margaret felt the first stirrings of something she couldn't name, a sensation like standing on ice that was thinner than it appeared, hearing the first fine cracks spreading beneath her weight. On the wall opposite the bed, she noticed something she had missed in her initial scan, a section of wallpaper that hung slightly loose, peeling away at the corner. She moved toward it instinctively, fingers finding the edge, and when she pulled gently, a 3-foot strip came away in her hand, revealing beneath it another layer of wallpaper, and beneath that another, like geological strata, recording the room's history in patterns of flowers and stripes and abstract geometries. She continued pulling, creating a pile of papery skin at her feet, until she reached a layer that stopped her cold. Beneath 7 decades of decoration, someone had written directly on the plaster in pencil, in handwriting she didn't recognize. The child who lives here will forget, but not forgive. The woman who returns will remember, but not believe. Look where the light doesn't reach. The words were surrounded by crude drawings, a house, a tree, a figure that might have been human, or might have been something else, its proportions subtly wrong. Margaret read the message 3 times, each reading making her pulse quicken, making the room feel smaller and the air thicker. She left the bedroom quickly, not quite running, but moving with purpose toward the stairs. But as she reached the hallway, she noticed something impossible, a door she didn't remember, positioned between her childhood room and what had been her parents' bedroom. The hallway wasn't long enough to accommodate another room. The geometry didn't allow for it. She could see both bedroom doors, could measure with her eyes the distance between them. And yet here was a third door, wood-paneled and old, with a brass knob that matched the key in her pocket with such perfect correspondence that she knew before trying that they belonged together. Margaret's hand went to her pocket automatically, fingers closing around the key's worn shape. She approached the impossible door the way one approaches a wounded animal. Slowly, ready to retreat, uncertain whether it will flee or attack. The door was narrower than standard, only about 2 feet wide, and the knob sat slightly lower than conventional, as if designed for someone smaller or for a different era's proportions. She inserted the key and felt tumblers move with a smoothness that suggested recent use, impossible given the house's abandonment. The door swung inward on hinges that didn't creak, revealing a space that defied the house's exterior dimensions. It was a room approximately 10 feet square, windowless, but somehow illuminated by a source Margaret couldn't identify. Not electric light, not candles, but something ambient and sourceless, like twilight that had been captured and preserved. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves sat hundreds of objects, each carefully labeled with tags that bore dates and names and short descriptions in the same handwriting from the bedroom wall. Margaret stepped inside, and the door closed behind her with a soft click. She wasn't alarmed. The space didn't feel threatening, merely separate, as if she had stepped out of the house entirely and into some adjacent dimension that occupied the same coordinates but operated under different rules. She moved to the nearest shelf and picked up the first object her hand found, a small glass bottle filled with what appeared to be water, labeled "Tears Cried on the Back Porch, August 17, 1971, after learning about the nature of permanence." She set it down carefully and picked up another, a piece of cloth, faded blue gingham, labeled "Fragment of the dress worn the day she discovered she could choose silence." Another, a bird's nest, perfectly preserved, labeled "Built in the oak tree this summer. She learned that homes are temporary." Another, a key identical to the one in her pocket, labeled "Copy made before the original was lost, before the door was forgotten, before the room chose to hide." There were hundreds of them. A pressed flower from 1968, a button from 1973, a marble that allegedly contained the last moment of pure joy before understanding disappointment, a spool of thread that promised what could have been sewn together but wasn't. Each object was mundane, small, easily overlooked, Yet each label suggested an enormous weight of meaning, a story compressed into artifact form. Margaret worked her way along the shelves in a state of suspended disbelief. Some part of her brain insisting this couldn't be real, while another part recognized every single object with the intimacy of ownership. She had cried those tears. She had worn that dress. She had found that marble in the garden and kept it in her pocket until it disappeared during the chaos of leaving home. But she had never cataloged these moments, had never preserved these objects, had never even known this room existed. Someone else had been collecting her life, archiving her experiences, maintaining a museum of her emotional education without her knowledge or consent. At the far end of the room stood a small writing desk, its surface clear except for a leather-bound journal and a fountain pen that looked like it belonged to another century. Margaret opened the journal to a random page and found it filled with entries in that same unfamiliar handwriting, each entry dated and titled like chapters in a biography. September 12, 1969. Today she saw her father cry for the first time and learned that strength has limits, that adults are fragile, that protection is an illusion we maintain for children until we can no longer sustain the performance. She will not remember this moment consciously, but will inform every relationship she builds, every trust she extends, every moment she decides whether to rely on another human being or carry weight alone. Margaret flipped forward several pages. March 3rd, 1972. Today she discovered the letters her mother hid in the sewing basket, written in her father's hand but never sent, addressed to a woman whose name she didn't recognize. She will replace them exactly as she found them and never speak of their existence. But the knowledge will settle into her bones like cold, and she will spend decades wondering what percentage of love is performance and what percentage is truth. She flipped backward. October 27th, 1967. Today she climbed the oak tree despite being told not to, climbed until the branches thinned and swayed beneath her weight, climbed until she could see over the house and into the neighbor's yard and beyond to the edge of town and the hills that promised elsewhere. She stayed in the tree until sunset, until her mother called her name with increasing panic. And when she finally descended, she brought down with her the understanding that staying and leaving are both choices, both betrayals, both forms of love. The journal contained hundreds of entries, thousands of pages, documenting moments Margaret remembered and moments she had completely forgotten, private experiences no one else could have witnessed, thoughts she had never spoken aloud. Reading them felt like being haunted by her own ghost, by some version of herself that had been watching, recording, preserving while she lived her life in ignorant forward motion. She read for what might have been minutes or hours. Time felt negotiable in this room, subject to revision, until she reached an entry dated the day she left home at 19. Today she leaves. She packs a single suitcase with the pragmatism of someone who's been planning this departure for years, who has weighed every object and found most wanting, who understands that escape requires traveling light. She takes 3 photographs, a sweater her grandmother knitted, the book her English teacher gave her with an inscription about potential, and a small painted rock from the garden that she cannot articulate why she needs, but knows she does. She does not take the letters from the sewing basket, does not take the marble with the trapped joy, does not take any of the carefully preserved artifacts from this room, because she does not know this room exists. She believes she is leaving her past behind. She does not understand yet that the past is portable, that memory is a room we carry inside us, that no distance is sufficient to escape the geography of childhood. Margaret's hands shook as she closed the journal. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, and she had the uncanny sensation of being watched, not by another person but by the house itself, by the accumulated weight of all these preserved moments. She turned toward the door and froze. Standing in the corner, she could have sworn was empty moments before it was a mirror, full-length, framed in dark wood, its surface slightly clouded as if with age or breath. But it wasn't reflecting the room. Instead, It showed her childhood bedroom from an angle that shouldn't exist, from a vantage point outside the house, looking into the window she had stood at earlier. And in the bedroom, visible through the window in the mirror, stood a child, perhaps 9 years old, wearing a white nightgown, hair dark and loose, face turned away but posture radiating attention, as if listening for something just beyond hearing. Margaret approached the mirror slowly, and as she moved, the image shifted, not following her but tracking something else, some other movement in some other time. The child in the mirror turned slightly, and Margaret saw in profile a face she recognized from old photographs. Herself at 9, the year before everything changed, before her father's accident, before her mother's withdrawal, before she learned that families are fragile architectures that can collapse under weights invisible from the outside. The child in the mirror raised one hand and placed it flat against the window glass from inside, and Margaret felt a corresponding pressure against her own palm, as if she were pressing back against that same window from the outside, as if 54 years had folded somehow and past and present were touching to the membrane of glass and reflection and memory. Margaret pulled her hand back from the mirror as if burned, the sensation of contact still tingling in her palm. The child in the reflection didn't move, didn't lower her hand, simply remained pressed against that window in a posture of waiting that suggested she had been there for decades, patient and unchanging, holding vigil for a moment that was only now arriving. The room seemed to contract around Margaret, the shelves leaning inward, the ceiling pressing down, and she had the sudden overwhelming certainty that if she didn't leave immediately, the door would disappear entirely, and she would be trapped here with all these preserved moments, with the archaeology of a life she had tried so hard to leave behind. She moved toward the door with purpose that bordered on panic, hand reaching for the knob, but as her fingers closed around the brass, she heard it. A sound so quiet she might have imagined it, a voice so young it could have been wind through cracks, words so familiar they stopped her breath. "Don't go yet. You haven't seen the important things." Margaret's hand froze on the doorknob. She didn't turn around, couldn't turn around, because looking would make it real, would confirm that the house was speaking or that she was losing her mind or that time had collapsed entirely and past and present were no longer separate countries, but the same location viewed from different angles. She stood perfectly still, listening to her own pulse, feeling sweat gather at her temples despite the room's coolness. The voice came again, slightly clearer now, with an echo quality that suggested it was traveling from somewhere distant. The fire didn't destroy anything important. The fire revealed. Look in the desk's bottom drawer. Look at what survived. Look at what was always meant to survive. Margaret's rational mind cataloged explanations. Stress hallucination. Carbon monoxide despite the house being abandoned for months. Some trick of acoustics and settling timbers that created the illusion of voice. But her body was already moving, turning from the door, crossing back to the desk, kneeling before it with the compliance of someone following a script she didn't know she'd memorized. The desk had 3 drawers on the right side. She opened the bottom one and found it contained a single item, a wooden box approximately the size of a shoebox, its surface carved with intricate patterns that formed no recognizable image, but suggested meaning just beyond interpretation, like words in a language almost familiar. The wood was dark, possibly walnut, and felt warm to the touch, as if it contained its own internal heat source. There was no lock, just a simple clasp, and when Margaret opened it, the hinges made a sound like an indrawn breath. Inside, nested in faded velvet, were letters, perhaps 30 of them, tied with a ribbon that had once been red but had faded to the pink of old scars. The paper was yellowed, the ink brown with age, and the handwriting on the envelopes was her mother's, unmistakably her mother's, that careful script with distinctive capital letters and looping descenders. But the letters weren't addressed to anyone. The envelope fronts were blank, except for dates spanning from 1967 to 1971, one letter for each month of those 5 years. Margaret lifted the bundle with trembling hands and untied the ribbon. The first envelope was dated September 1967, 2 months after the accident that had killed her father and shattered the family's stability like dropped china. She slid the letter out and unfolded it, and the paper crackled with a sound like small bones breaking. "My dearest girl," it began, and Margaret's throat constricted because her mother had never called her that, had never used endearments, had been loving in practical ways but verbally reserved, as if affection spoken aloud might somehow diminish or expire. "Today you asked me if Daddy is coming back, and I lied to you. I said maybe. Said we don't know. Said the doctors are trying very hard. But I knew the moment the phone rang. Knew from the tone of the voice on the other end. Knew before words were spoken that he was gone, and we were changed, and the life we had been living was finished. I lied because you are 7 years old, and the truth is too heavy, and I am trying to carry it for both of us. But I don't know how long I can bear this weight before it crushes something essential inside me." Margaret read through tears that blurred the words, then wiped her eyes and continued. The letter went on for 3 pages, documenting the mother's grief, her fear, her desperate attempts to maintain normalcy while internally fragmenting, her awareness that she was failing her daughter even as she tried her hardest not to. It was raw, honest, devastating. Everything her mother had never been able to express in person, preserved here in ink and paper like a message in a bottle thrown into an ocean of time. She opened the next letter, dated October 1967. "Today you drew a picture of our family, and you only included 3 people, you, me, and your father. You didn't include the baby I'm carrying, the child I haven't told you about because I don't know how to explain that life continues even when it feels obscene for it to do so, that your father's death and this new life are simultaneous, that joy and grief can occupy the same moment and nearly destroy you with their contradiction." Margaret stopped reading, her mind reeling. She had a sibling, had a sibling. The letters confirmed it in subsequent months. A brother born in December 1967, alive for only 6 days, dying of complications her mother described in clinical detail, as if documentation could create distance from pain, as if naming all the medical failures could somehow make them make sense. "I didn't tell you about him," the January 1968 letter explained, "because you had already lost too much, and I couldn't bear to watch you lose more. I told you I was sick, told you I was in the hospital for my heart, and when I came home empty-handed and empty-armed, you accepted the lie because children trust their mothers to tell them the truth, and I weaponized that trust. I am a coward. I am trying to protect you, and in doing so am teaching you that love means silence, that grief is shameful, that we carry our losses alone." Letter after letter documented the mother's internal collapse, her attempts to function, her growing awareness that her silence was building walls between her and her daughter, walls that would eventually become permanent. The letters were apologies, confessions, explanations for behavior Margaret had experienced but never understood. The distance, the coldness, the moments of staring into space as if she had forgotten anyone else existed. The final letter was dated August 1971, written shortly before Margaret's 11th birthday. "Today you asked me why I never smile anymore, and I couldn't answer. How do I explain that smiling feels like betrayal, that happiness would dishonor the dead, that I've forgotten how to feel anything but wait? You are growing distant from me, and I can see it happening but cannot stop it, like watching a boat drift from shore, knowing I should swim after it, but finding myself unable to move, anchored by something I cannot name. I am writing these letters because I cannot speak them, preserving them here in this room that only I know exists, this space that somehow was already here when we moved in, as if the house knew we would need it, as if walls could anticipate grief and build chambers to contain it. Someday, if you ever find this place, you will understand that I loved you desperately and failed you completely, and those two truths are not contradictory, but are instead the defining tension of motherhood, the gap between intention and execution, between the parent we wish to be and the parent we are capable of being." Margaret sat on the floor of the impossible room. surrounded by artifact of her own life and her mother's hidden pain, and wept with completeness she had not allowed herself in decades. She cried for the child who had been protected from truth at the cost of intimacy, for the mother who had drowned in silence, for the brother she had never met and never mourned because she had never known to mourn him, for the family that had shattered and the pieces that had been swept up and hidden away rather than grieved properly. When the tears subsided, she felt hollowed out, but also somehow lighter, as if crying had excavated space inside her that had been packed solid with unprocessed loss. She carefully returned the letters to their box, retied the ribbon, and stood, looking around the room with new understanding. This wasn't a museum of her life. This was her mother's attempt to preserve what couldn't be spoken, to document what couldn't be shared, to maintain connection across silence. She understood now why the room had hidden itself, why it had only revealed its presence now, after decades, after her mother's death, after enough time had passed that the truth could be encountered without the complication of confrontation or the possibility of repair. The house had kept these secrets the way soil keeps bones, waiting for the right conditions to bring them to the surface. Margaret moved back to the mirror, which now reflected only the room she stood in, no longer showing visions of the past. But as she watched, words began to appear on the mirror's surface as if written by an invisible finger, forming slowly in a script she recognized as her mother's. "I'm sorry I couldn't say this while I lived. I'm sorry I taught you that love was silent. I'm sorry I let you leave thinking you were abandoned rather than letting you know you were carrying my heart with you into whatever life you build away from here. I put these objects in this room not to trap you, but to give you back what silence stole, the knowledge that you were seen, that your life was precious, that every moment was witnessed even when I couldn't speak my witnessing aloud." The words remained visible for perhaps 30 seconds, then faded like breath from glass, and Margaret understood she had been given a gift she didn't know she needed. Not closure, exactly, but context, the missing story that explained the gaps in her own narrative, the reasons behind the silences that had shaped her. She left the room and found the door remained open behind her, no longer hidden, but clearly visible now that she knew to look for it. The house seemed different as she moved through it, less like a ruin and more like a text she was learning to read. Each charred wall and collapsed beam telling a story about destruction and preservation, about what burns away and what survives, about the ways time and tragedy reshape the places we come from. Margaret spent the next 6 hours exploring the house with new eyes, searching for other hidden spaces, other preserved secrets. She found no more impossible rooms, but she discovered subtler revelations. In the backyard, beneath overgrown grass, the outline of a small grave marked with a smooth river stone that bore no name, just dates. December 22, 1967 to December 28, 1967. Her brother, buried here on the property, which explained why her mother had never moved, never sold the house, never let it go even after Margaret left, and the place stood empty for decades. Inside the tool shed at the property's edge, she found boxes of her childhood artwork, carefully stored in plastic bins that had protected them from moisture and time. Crayon drawings of families, watercolor experiments, crude clay sculptures that had somehow been fired and preserved. Beneath the art, she found report cards, certificates from spelling bees and science fairs, evidence of a life her mother had documented even when she couldn't participate in it actively, like a naturalist recording the behavior of a creature too wild or too distant to touch. In the attic, accessible by a pull-down ladder that groaned with disuse, she found her father's belongings, also carefully preserved, his tools, his work clothes still hanging in garment bags, his collection of records, his journals filled with sketches and calculations, evident an inner life she had never known he possessed. She sat in the dust and heat and read his entries in the months before his death, finding in him a man anxious about money, worried about providing, terrified of failing his family, and desperately, achingly in love with his wife and daughter in ways he apparently couldn't articulate except in private writing. The house was not a ruin, The house was an archive. Every room contained evidence of love that had been inarticulate, preserved by someone, her mother, Shirley, who understood that memory is fragile and needed physical anchors, that the dead require representation in the world of objects because they can no longer represent themselves. As the evening approached and light through the broken roof turned golden, Margaret made a decision. She would not sell the property or bulldoze the structure. She would restore it carefully, preserving what could be preserved and rebuilding what couldn't. She would live here, at least for a time, long enough to properly excavate all these buried stories, long enough to understand the full shape of what she had fled from at 19, long enough to reconcile with the girl she had been and the woman she had become. She called her daughter that evening from a motel room in town, explaining in broad strokes about the inheritance, the house, the discoveries. Her daughter listened with characteristic practicality, asking about structural integrity and insurance, and whether Margaret had really thought this through. Margaret assured her she had. Though this wasn't entirely true, she was operating on intuition rather than logic, following a pull that felt less like choice and more like obligation. The way salmon return to their spawning grounds not because they want to, but because they must. Over the following weeks, Margaret hired contractors, engineers, restoration specialists. She showed them the house and explained what needed to be preserved. Certain walls, certain rooms, certain objects that survived the fire through what seemed like deliberate mercy. The contractors were puzzled by her insistence on keeping damaged materials that could easily be replaced, but they accommodated her requests, perhaps sensing that this was about more than mere renovation. During demolition and reconstruction, more discoveries emerged. Behind a wall in the dining room, workers found a time capsule of sorts, a metal box containing items from 1967, a newspaper from the day of her father's accident, his wedding ring, a baby's hospital bracelet, photographs of Margaret as an infant, a letter from her father to her mother written before they married, speaking of dreams and future and the life they would build together. In the foundation, they found architectural anomalies, spaces that didn't appear on any blueprint, rooms that existed in physical form but not on paper, suggesting that the house had been modified over decades by someone with knowledge of its structure and a need for places to hide things. Margaret's mother, she realized, had been not just a preserver of objects, but an engineer of secrets, building the infrastructure for memory to survive. The restoration took 4 months. During that time, Margaret rented a small apartment in town and spent her days at the house, supervising work, but also sitting in rooms as they transformed, bearing witness to the process of taking something broken and making a whole without erasing evidence of the breaking. She insisted that certain burn marks remain visible, that the scars of fire be preserved beneath new paint, that the history of damage be legible to anyone who knew to look. She also began writing her own letters, continuing practice her mother had started. She wrote to her father, telling him about the life he'd missed, about the granddaughter he'd never met, about the ways his death had shaped her and the ways she had survived that shaping. She wrote to her brother who had lived only 6 days, telling him about the world he hadn't gotten to experience, about the sister he would have had, about the family they might have been. She wrote to her mother, responding to those decades-old letters, answering questions that had been left hanging in silence, offering forgiveness for failures that Margaret now understood were universal, the gaps between intention and ability that define every parent-child relationship. She kept these letters in the hidden room, adding her own artifact to the shelves, objects from her adult life, tokens of experiences her mother hadn't witnessed but which felt important to document. A ticket stub from her wedding, a hospital bracelet from her daughter's birth, a rejection letter from a job she desperately wanted and didn't get, a photograph of herself at 50 looking directly at the camera with an expression she could now name as survival. The room accepted these additions without comment, the shelves expanding in ways that seemed physically impossible but which Margaret no longer questioned. She had learned that the house operated under its own logic, that it was less a building and more an organism, growing and adapting to meet the needs of those who live within its walls. When the restoration was finally complete in early October, Margaret hosted a small gathering. Her daughter and son-in-law, a few neighbors who remembered the house from decades ago, the contractors who had done the work. She gave tours, showing how the structure had been salvaged and rebuilt, pointing out original features that had been preserved and new elements that had been carefully integrated. She didn't mention the hidden room. Some things required privacy, required protection from explanation. But after everyone left and she was alone in the house for the first time since taking ownership, she went to that room and found it changed again. The shelves now contained new items she hadn't placed there. A photograph of herself at 19 on the day she left home. One she had never seen before, but which captured perfectly the mixture of determination and fear on her face. A newspaper clipping from her wedding announcement that her mother must have saved. A program from her daughter's college graduation. Evidence that her mother had remained connected to her life even across the distance Margaret had established. That love had persisted even when communication hadn't. And on the desk, she found a final letter in her mother's handwriting. Though the paper was pristine and the ink fresh, as if it had been written yesterday rather than decades ago, as if time in this room operated under different rules. My dearest girl, if you're reading this, you've found your way home. Not the physical home, which is just walls and memory, but the understanding that home is what we carry, the accumulated weight of all we've been, and all we've lost, and all we've survived. I couldn't give you this while I lived because I was too lost in my own grief to see past it, too trapped in silence to break through to sound. But this house remembered for me, preserved for me, kept everything safe until you were ready to receive it. You left at 19 thinking you were escaping, and you were right to leave. Stay would have trapped you in my grief, would have taught you that life is about endurance rather than joy. But now you can return not as a child fleeing pain, but as a woman capable of holding pain and joy simultaneously, of understanding that we are shaped by loss but not defined by it, that the past is not a cage but a foundation, something we build upon rather than something that imprisons us. Live here if you want, or don't. Sell the house. Keep it. Burn it down again for all it matters. The point was never the structure. The point was a giving back of your own story, complete with all the parts one kept from you, all the context that makes sense of silences. You were loved. You are loved. That love was imperfect, was filtered through grief and trauma and human limitation, but it was real and it was constant and it survives even death, even decades, even distance. This is what I couldn't say while alive, why I needed the house to save for me, what I needed time and architecture and preservation to communicate when my own voice failed. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for staying long enough to listen. Thank you for being brave enough to excavate what I buried. Now go live, really live, carrying these stories but not weighed down by them. Know where you came from and choosing where you'll go. This is my gift, not the house, but the truth. Take it and be free. The book took 2 years to complete, and when it was done, she placed a manuscript in the hidden room alongside all the other artifacts, adding it to the archive not for publication, but for preservation, another layer in the archaeological record of her family's emotional history. On the 3rd anniversary of finding the house, Margaret held a small ceremony in the backyard near her brother's unmarked grave. She planted a tree, an oak, because oaks last, because they provide shelter, because it would have grown here before and should grow here again. She invited her daughter and granddaughter, and together they stood in silence as the sun set. 3 generations of women who had survived, who carried stories, who understood now that family history is not a burden to escape, but a map to understand, showing us where we've been and suggesting where we might go, marking the terrain we navigate as we build our own lives on the foundation of those who came before. The house stands now as it stood then, but transformed. The burned sections have been rebuilt, the collapsed roof restored, the the windows replaced with glass that catches light and throws it back in patterns that shift with the seasons. But if you look closely, you can still see the scars, faint discolorations in the wood where flames licked but didn't consume, slight warping in boards that survived heat, shadows in corners where it settled into grain and couldn't be fully erased. These marks are not failures of restoration, but intentional preservations, evidence that the house was broken and chose to heal rather than hiding the fact of breaking. Margaret lives there still, though she travels frequently now, speaking and writing and visiting her daughter and granddaughter who have begun their own archiving practices, understanding finally that documentation is not vanity but responsibility, that future generations deserve to know the full, complicated truth of those who came before. The hidden room remains, growing in ways that defy physics, accommodating infinite artifacts in finite space, operating as it always is under its own logic, which is a logic of memory and preservation, of love that persists beyond death, of truth that waits decades for the moment when it can be received. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Margaret sits in that room and speaks aloud to her mother, to her father, to her brother who never lived long enough to be known. She tells them about her life, about the joys and sorrows they missed, about the granddaughter who has their eyes and their stubbornness, about the ways she has carried them forward even when she thought she was leaving them behind. And sometimes, in the quality of silence that follows her speaking, she swears she can feel response. Not words, exactly, but a shifting in the room's atmosphere, a warmth that might be memory or might be something more persistent, something that suggests the dead are not absent but adjacent, separated by the thinnest membrane, waiting not to haunt but to be remembered, to be integrated, to be carried forward into the lives of those who survived them. The house is no longer abandoned, but neither is it simply occupied. It exists in a state between, a structure that is simultaneously past and present, museum and home, memorial and living space. People who visit comment on its atmosphere, on the way time seems slightly elastic within its walls, on the sensation of being watched not threateningly but attentively, as if the house itself is aware, is witnessing, is keeping careful record of all who pass through its rooms. Margaret no longer tries to explain this. She simply smiles and offers tea and lets people interpret the space according to their own capacity for understanding that some places are more than wood and nails and intention, that some structures are built not just by carpenters but by need, by grief, by the human requirement for places where truth can be stored when it's too heavy to carry, where secrets can wait until the moment arrives for their revelation. The burned-out house they gave her was never really about the house at all. It was about what houses hold, what walls remember, what spaces can preserve when humans cannot. It was about the gift of return, of second chances, of discovering that the past is not fixed but flexible, subject to reinterpretation when new information arrives. It was about a daughter finding her mother decades after death, finding her not as a failure or abandonment, but as a complex human doing the best she could with the tools she had, which were insufficient but deployed with love, which is perhaps all any of us can manage. Insufficient tools, full hearts, and the hope that somehow, eventually, the love will translate across the gaps between what we mean and what we're capable of expressing. Margaret is 76 now, 3 years older than when she first received that envelope, 3 years deeper into this unexpected final chapter of integration and understanding. She knows she will not live forever, knows that eventually she will become another presence in this house's long memory, another layer in its archaeological record. She has made arrangements. The house will pass to her daughter, who will pass it to her daughter, who will pass it forward into generations not yet born, each inheriting not just structure but story, not just property but responsibility, the obligation to maintain the archive, to add to it, to keep careful record of love in all its inadequate, essential forms. And the hidden room will persist, she trusts, will continue its impossible expansion, will accept the artifact of lives not yet lived, will serve for future generations as it served for her, as evidence that we are seen, that our lives matter, that someone is keeping track, that the universe, through whatever mechanism, ensures that nothing is truly lost, that all our moments of joy and sorrow and mundane Tuesday afternoons are somehow recorded, somehow preserved, somehow maturing in ways we cannot fully comprehend, but must trust are real. This is what she found in the burned-out house they gave her, not just letters and artifacts and explanations for childhood pain, but a philosophy, a framework for understanding how love persists and how the dead remain with us, and how return is always possible if we're brave enough to face what we fled. She found that houses remember, that walls witness, that space itself can hold love when humans cannot, that grief, properly tended, transforms into something else. Not happiness, exactly, but integration, the sense that sorrow is part of the landscape rather than the whole terrain, that loss is one note in a complex chord rather than a single sustained tone that drowns out all other sound. The house stands. Margaret lives. The room preserves. And somewhere in the infinite gap between past and present, between the living and the dead, between what was said and what was meant, love persists, imperfect, inarticulate, insufficient, and absolutely, undeniably real. This is what changed her life. Not finding the house, but understanding finally what houses mean, what they hold, what they give back to us when we're ready to receive it. The gift was always waiting. She just needed 54 years and a burned structure and a key that fit an impossible door to become ready to accept it.